Have you ever felt like a complete and total stranger living inside your own body? And you see, I mean that exact unsettling moment when suddenly, without warning, you hear your own voice loudly shouting out things that you never actually intended to say at all. Or when you see your hand suddenly reaching for that ultra-processed food you promised yourself you'd avoid, and you look at it as if that hand didn't belong to you. You see, we've been sold the big lie that freedom is a matter of morals, of wanting something strongly, or simply of having character. But today I'm going to show you that your willpower is not a virtue. Your willpower is actually a budget. And I'm not talking about a budget in the sense of an assumption. I'm talking about a bill that has to be paid. Your willpower is not an abstract desire. It's a budget item that, as I was saying, has to be paid and in cash. Every time your brain has to stop an impulse, your mitochondria have to release electrons. And if there's no money in the bank, if you don't have that surplus voltage, your biological bank cuts off your credit and you become a true plaything of your own instincts. Freedom is a luxury for those whose energy accounts are in good shape. If your voltage doesn't reach the minimum, your freedom is an illusion. You're simply a biological puppet carrying out survival programs out of sheer exhaustion. Therefore, I welcome you to the climax and also the end of this series. You see, we haven't spent weeks rebuilding your cathedral and mine just to make it a beautiful monument, but to reclaim the throne of your sovereignty. And if today you're in the negative, you're not in control. Your deficiencies are. So get ready, because we're going to discover how much it costs electrically to become the master of your own life again. But before we dive into the heart of this final chapter of the series, I want to thank you in a special way for being here with me, for listening to me, and for accompanying me. As you may have noticed, I've been a bit distant these past few weeks, and that's because my own cathedral has gone through a forced maintenance process that almost turned into demolition. This past January, I had a pacemaker replaced, and since then I started, thank you, to deal with a daily fever that had no explanation. I went to several doctors. In fact, I saw 6 doctors on 6 different occasions, and all 6 told me the same thing. Look, you're perfectly fine. Look at your tests. The results are impeccable. But I was fading away. My chemistry, the test said one thing, but my physics, my voltage told me something else. And the miracle happened last Monday thanks to a woman named Almudena. Almudena is a nurse in the cardiology department at the medical and hospital center I usually go to. So I went to make an appointment to see a doctor to properly adjust my pacemaker, and when she saw me arrive, she didn't look at my papers. What she did was look at me. She saw my appearance and understood that something in my system was collapsing. And instead of giving me an appointment for weeks later, what she did was tell me, I'm not going to give you an appointment, sit down, because I'm going to talk to the doctor so he can see you immediately. And Almudena was the angel who opened the door, who ultimately saved my life. She took me to Dario, the 7th doctor in this long list of doctors who kept telling me I was perfectly fine and should go home. And yet, Dario was the only one who decided to listen to what my body was silently screaming, instead of paying attention to what some perfect test results were saying. Well, thanks to Dario's careful listening, they eventually discovered that deep within my heart, nestled among the tangled wires of old pacemakers from over 30 years ago, there were entire hives of aggressive, or I should say, incredibly super aggressive bacteria that were slowly devouring my body's command center. And given the aggressiveness of the bacteria and the danger they sensed my life was in, 3 days later they opened my chest, cut my sternum, and diverted. my life to an artificial heart. And all of this was so they could thoroughly clean my heart and remove the wires that had been left behind. And today I am here giving thanks to God and to people like Almudena and Dario, as well as to the rest of the medical and nursing team at the hospital, because they acted quickly, because they were very professional, because it seems they were able to eliminate the danger. And also because they managed to remove those old wires left in my heart when the pacemaker was replaced with a new one. They simply came out easily, against all odds. Thank God. Well, I am sharing all of this with you today because my personal health has truly passed the ultimate test. You see, if I hadn't established a solid voltage base for myself, and if I hadn't fully understood that my physical body required a deep energy reserve to withstand the challenges, I simply wouldn't have made it. I had to endure the intense suffering I went through for many weeks, followed by a medical surgery as major and complex as the one I just described to you. Without that preparation, I honestly wouldn't be standing here talking to you today. Conventional medicine looked closely at my clinical test results, and I looked at my actual energy, and that is the profound difference between being perfect on paper or being truly alive in reality, right here with you, just you and me together. And you might ask me, why would an aggressive bacteria choose to settle precisely on wires that have been there for 30 years in such a dynamic organ as the heart and not somewhere else? And the answer is not in biology. The answer is in physics. You see, in our cathedral, pathogens are the agents of entropy. They do not attack where there is light, where there is order, and where there is voltage. They seek out areas of electrical shadow, and those old wires had over the decades become lawless territories. They were basically dead spots, in areas where the electrical conductivity was so low that my own immune system, which requires a specific amount of millivolts to effectively patrol the body and be capable of launching an attack, simply was unable to receive the necessary electrical signal, and therefore it failed to enter to do its job. Think of a police patrol that can't enter a neighborhood because it doesn't have a radio or lights. Well, that's basically what happens. When the voltage drops, it creates a refuge, a true haven for chaos. This is what is commonly referred to as the fundamental law of attraction of entropy. In places where energy no longer flows, chaos and disorder inevitably begin to settle in. And those bacteria weren't just a mere unfortunate stroke of random bad luck. They were nothing less than true biological squatters that took full advantage of a specific part of my internal structure being left completely in the dark. My surgery wasn't just about cleaning out bugs. It was a forced reconnection of the wires so that life could speak again in that area, which is my heart. Because as we'll see now, if there's no electrical flow, there's no possible sovereignty over the territory. And you see, that's where the lesson I take from all of this comes in. Sometimes life pushes you to remember that even the architect must watch over his own foundations. I've had to focus on my own voltage, on making sure that my biological ground wasn't compromised by the accumulated stress of these months of work, and in the end, this absence hasn't been time lost. This is my personal reflection. In reality, it has been a trial by fire for everything I've been telling you in these videos about each of our cathedrals, about yours and about mine. The truth is that I've used, or I could almost say I've had to use, although I've already been using them, each of the protocols that you and I have analyzed here. From structured water to the radical silencing of electromagnetic fields or even autophagy. I had to become the master of my own voltage again in order to return today with an authority that only comes from having been in the trenches and being able to come back from them. My health is my testing ground. And what I have learned during this pause is what will give meaning to everything we have built together. In order for you to understand what is at stake today, in this series finale, we have to look back and see a bit of the magnitude of the work we have built. You can't comprehend this ending if you don't grasp that your body is an electrical system before it is a chemical one. What happened to my heart was not a failure of the chemistry of my blood. It was a network failure, a true network failure due to conductivity in the water that makes up my body. And to understand how that energy transport network works and why the water you drink, thank you, is a lie if it doesn't have a charge. We have to make a necessary stop and focus on the life and work of a fascinating man we've already talked about on several occasions. He was a person who decided to challenge the entire scientific community, Gerald Pollack. As I've told you, he was a professor of bioengineering at the University of Washington. A man who began his career studying something as specific as muscle contraction. Pollack could have stayed in the comfort of traditional academia, but his curiosity was too great, and he realized that the textbooks failed at something fundamental. They didn't explain how the water inside a cell could behave so differently from the water that comes out of a tap. Gerald Pollack is one of those brave scientists who, despite criticism, decided to investigate the physics of water beyond just its chemistry. And his experiments led him to discover the fourth phase of water. And we've already talked about it many times. What I had never asked myself, and a follower asked me the other day, is what are the other three? And it's very easy because you know them all. Solid, ice, liquid water, and gas vapor. And the fourth was the one Pollack discovered. Pollack observed that when water touches a surface, such as our cell membranes, and when it receives light, especially infrared, it organizes itself into a perfect hexagonal network. It is certainly not a liquid, and it is not exactly ice. Rather, it is a unique, negatively charged gel that he specifically called the exclusion zone, or simply EZ. Interestingly, this type of water has a completely different chemical formula, H3O2, and it literally functions just like a powerful biological battery. Thanks to his life dedicated to this study, today we know that our cells are charged by sunlight and contact with the earth. And we've talked about this many times, but it's worth reviewing it in this closing episode. Without that conductivity that Pollack mapped out, your cathedral simply remains in the dark. And here you see it's not just about drinking liquid. What it's really about, and this is the most important thing, is maintaining a vibrant electrical network. We also saw how your DNA is not just a highly complex instructional manual, but an antenna that is capable of receiving and processing frequencies. And how if you don't properly detoxify and flush out your glymphatic system at night, your brain basically turns into an environment filled with acidic waste and toxins. We also went through the supermarket looking for conductive minerals like shilajit, sea moss, and cucumber. Try incorporating aloe vera or chia seeds, so that your internal biological regeneration software has the tools it requires to work effectively. And all of that in addition to insulin, sugar, which acts like battery acid, the sun, and grounding were the bricks and the wiring. But why would you want a perfectly electrified cathedral if there's no one sitting on the throne to give the orders? And this is where one of the brightest minds of the 20th century comes into play, Erwin Schrödinger. You might know him, or his name might sound familiar because of his famous cat in a box, but Schrödinger was much more than just a quantum physicist. You see, this was a deeply spiritual man and a rebel who fled Nazi Vienna to take refuge in Dublin in 1944. And there, far from the noise of war, he asked himself a question that would change biology forever. Look at what a seemingly silly question he asked himself. What is life? And with just that, he proposed something revolutionary. He said that life is a heroic effort to go against the universe. There is a non-negotiable law, the second law of thermodynamics, which says that everything tends toward disorder, that is, toward entropy. And if you stop putting energy into a system, chaos devours it. Well, what Schrödinger did was teach us that being alive is maintaining a state of negentropy, which is the opposite of entropy, or in other words, order. And that struggle is one with voltage. A healthy cell at minus 90 millivolts is basically a fortress of order. However, when your voltage drops to minus 20 millivolts, entropy comes in through the front door, disorder takes over the structure, and what classical medicine calls disease appears. The cathedral you see before you remains standing because there is a constant flow of electric current. That is the only thing preventing the laws of inanimate physics from turning you into nothing but dust. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger actually predicted the existence of the complex structure of DNA years before it was first seen. And he specifically called it an aperiodic crystal. He was an exceptionally gifted and brilliant scientific talent, and he deeply understood the fundamental truth that all forms of life are essentially information sustained by energy. But you see, the great revelation, the one that gives you back control of your life, has to do with your ability to decide. And to talk about this, we're going to travel to San Francisco in the 1980s to the laboratory of Benjamin Libet. Libet was a neurophysiologist who became obsessed with measuring the exact moment when a decision is born. And his experiments were an earthquake, a tension. For philosophers, he placed electrodes on the brains of volunteers and discovered that neurons sent out the command to act, which he called the readiness potential, about 500 milliseconds before the person was consciously aware of having decided anything. Impressive. In other words, it seemed that we were reactive machines, or put another way, slaves to our own unconscious. But Oliver, who always believed in human freedom, found the loophole and called it the Sacred Veto. He discovered that between the unconscious impulse and the physical action, there is a window of about 200 milliseconds where consciousness can say no. In other words, we don't choose the impulse that arises from our gut or from a stressful environment, but we have absolute sovereignty to stop it. However, here is the secret that nobody tells you, and that I am telling you and will tell you today. That conscious veto, that act of saying no to a primary instinct, consumes an immensely greater amount of electrical energy and ATP than simply letting yourself go. That is to say, to be the master of yourself, you need to be charged, you have to keep your voltage at high levels. Think of this as if it were a real-time bank transaction. Following an impulse, that shout that burns inside you or that sweet treat that attracts you is like going downhill. It's something that's free because the gravity of your instincts does the work for you. But, nevertheless, exercising the sacred veto of the ibex, that is, stopping that 20-ton truck dead in its tracks in just 200 milliseconds, is the most expensive operation your brain performs. It requires a spike of ATP and a massive discharge of electrons. And if your biological bank account is in the red, your brain's card reader simply declines the transaction. Look, you get the standard notification pop up on your screen. It says there are insufficient funds available in your account. And at that very moment, biology, thank you, takes away your license to be a free human and demotes you to the category of automaton. And it's not that you don't want to be free, it's just that you simply can't afford it. Libet left us the map of those golden milliseconds. If your cathedral is drained and your mitochondria are flooded with sugar and cortisol, your system goes into energy-saving mode. And the first thing the body shuts down to survive is the top floor, the prefrontal cortex. And you might ask me, what exactly is this prefrontal cortex? Well, imagine it as if it were the CEO's office or the king's throne in your brain. That's it. It's right behind your forehead, that is here. And it's what makes us human, truly human, because that's where morality, planning, and above all, that impulse control Libet talked about, reside. It's basically the handbrake for your most animal instincts. But it's an area that consumes a huge amount of millivolts. And for the king to be able to make lucid decisions, he basically needs an electrical supply, and it needs to be flawless. Something like between minus 70 millivolts or minus 90 millivolts of mental agility. And yet, when your voltage drops, the body simply turns off the lights in the attic so the heart can keep beating in the basement. You become irritable, impulsive, and easy to manipulate. And when you drop below minus 50 millivolts, you also lose your dignity because you lose your ability to say no. It's not that the king is a coward who runs away when things get tough. It's that the king is a responsible manager, and the prefrontal cortex is the luxury floor of your cathedral, and like any luxury attic, it has extremely high maintenance costs. Just so you know, it consumes almost 20% of all your body's energy, despite being only a small fraction of its weight. And when your energy budget goes into deficit, your body, which is a relentless resource manager, implements an emergency cutback. And you see, it doesn't shut down the basement, because if the heart stops, the whole enterprise collapses. What it does is declare a state of insolvency in the throne. Your critical thinking shuts down, your ethics shut down, your patience shuts down. And it is not because they are not absolutely vital or significant, but simply because the king has completely exhausted his entire financial budget to pay the monthly electricity bill. You have completely lost your guiding conductor, and now your deep primal instincts are starting to play whatever they truly want. To put it quite simply, the voltage of your dignity is the extraordinary surplus of inner energy that allows you to inhabit the highest and most noble levels of your mind. And here lies the tragedy of our era, of our times, because we live in a state of constant energy inflation, Wi-Fi, the blue light from screens, chronic stress, and all those acidic foods that are like abusive taxes. They drain your current account without you even realizing it. You spend the day working a full 8-hour shift, but your body feels as if it has just run an electric marathon, which is why you return home with no patience left for your children, or find yourself easily giving in to any temptation. Your voltage is on the floor. You've spent your entire daily budget on revolutionary taxes from an environment specifically designed to drain you. That's why it's vital to know how much you have left in the bank. And you'll see, here's the problem. I know that many of you ask me in the comments, but Jose Maria, how can I measure my millivolts at home? That is, how can I measure my voltage? And on this, I have to be honest, and I've been answering those who... To answer your questions, nowadays there is no simple at-home way to measure those minus 90 millivolts inside the cell with a device you could buy at a store. Conventional multimeters measure the resistance of the skin, but they can't get inside the cell without laboratory microelectrodes. But it's not all bad news. Nature has left us a compass, pH. You see, there is a direct mathematical relationship between the pH level of your fluids and your voltage. And therefore, you can make an approximate calculation using this logic. For example, a pH of 7.45, that is alkaline, corresponds to those minus 20 millivolts that the cell needs to function. But to regenerate, we need to reach a pH that gives us those minus 90 millivolts. Well, so that you can calculate how to reach that, what I recommend is that you do the calculation using this formula, which isn't perfect, but it's approximate. The voltage is more or less 61 multiplied by the pH minus 7. Or in other words, you subtract 7 from the pH value you get and then multiply that number by 61. And if you measure your pH with a test strip and it comes out acidic, that is below 7, your voltage is on the floor and your ray is in the dark. But here, allow me to pause for a moment to explain where that number 61 comes from, which you multiply by the amount of your pH minus 7. As you can imagine, it's not a number I made up just to make the story fit somehow. This is a fundamental constant of physics that explains how chemistry is translated into electricity. You see, that 61 comes from what we know in science as, thank you, as the Nernst Equation, and to keep it simple, imagine that this number is something like the official exchange rate between two currencies. Chemistry, which is the hydrogen protons we measure with pH, and electricity, which is the millivolts of your battery. Well, this is the exchange currency. And physically, that 61 is the result of combining three values that do not change in a healthy human body. First, the gas constant. Second, your body temperature, which we normally calculate as about 37 degrees Celsius. And third, the Faraday constant, which tells us how much electric charge is in 1 mole of electrons. Well, when you put all of this into the mathematical blender and convert from natural logarithms to base 10 logarithms, that's where you get that 61.5, which we round down to 61. Thank you. To make it easier to work with, and that's why I said it was approximate. Well, basically what that number is telling you is that for every point you manage to raise your pH, you are injecting exactly 61 millivolts of electrical pressure into your cells. And why do I say that the result is the electrical currency in the bank? And you'll see. Here lies the key to everything. Voltage is, by definition, potential energy. That is, it is the system's ability to perform work, to repair tissue, or for your mind to make a difficult decision. Imagine a water reservoir. The voltage is not the water itself, but the height at which it is held. Because the higher the wall, the more voltage or force the water will have as it falls to move the turbines. In your body, if you have minus 90 millivolts, what you have is an enormous height, an incredible capacity for your mitochondria to produce energy, repair tissues, and, as we've seen, for your prefrontal cortex to exercise that veto of freedom, which makes you a free person. And to understand this better, maybe another example will help. Imagine a drawn bow, and the voltage is the tension in the string. But if the string is loose, the voltage is low. And no matter how much you want to shoot the arrow of your will, that arrow won't go anywhere. And acidity is like a real acid that corrodes that string. When your body becomes more acidic, it means you have a much higher concentration of hydrogen protons constantly running around within your plasma. These active protons act like real thieves, stealing the vital electrons that your system desperately needs to tighten the bow and maintain balance. Being at minus 50 millivolts is like being technically bankrupt, where you simply don't have enough currency to pay for the basic repair processes, let alone afford the luxury of being the free man we were talking about. However, if your pH is alkaline, your cathedral shines. You don't need an expensive laboratory. What you need is to understand that your acidity is your lack of energy. And therefore, when that calculation gives you a poor figure, what you're looking at is your reality without any makeup. You're technically bankrupt. So it's no longer a matter of whether you want the triple or not. It's that your biology simply declares itself insolvent. You don't have the currency to pay for the king's upkeep on his throne, nor to stop the attacks of entropy that are dismantling you from within. You are literally a system in the red, just waiting for any impulse or any deficiency to take control for you and run your life. That's why, if your electron statement tells you today that you can't make it to the end of the month, we can't afford a slow reform, you need an emergency financial bailout. An injection of capital that brings light back to your cathedral before the system collapses completely. And I've prepared a rapid startup protocol for you, which isn't just a list of healthy tips. Don't take it that way. It's a true emergency capital injection designed to deposit electrons into your system in record time and allow your prefrontal cortex, prefrontal, to regain control. Before you make a mistake you'll later regret. To begin with, you should look for a reliable way to ground yourself and find some stability. 2 minutes barefoot on grass or soil will stabilize the electrical noise in your system. And if you live in a cold climate or don't have access to grass or soil, look for one of those mats that ground you through your home's electrical outlet. Just a few minutes are enough to stabilize. Second, restore your conductivity. Keep in mind that without electrolytes, the king's commands only get halfway through. To ensure the best possible charge, what I usually recommend are these alternatives that work wonderfully for mineralizing. That's structured water and making sure that the voltage of your body, your cathedral, does not drop. Unrefined sea salt or spring salt. This is the most basic option and sometimes the most powerful. And here I'm not talking about regular table salt, which, as we've discussed on other occasions, we know is dead. I'm talking about Celtic salt, Brittany salt, or spring salt. Or a good salt from local salt flats that hasn't gone through chemical processes. This salt provides dozens of trace minerals that will act like the wires through which your internal electricity travels. A pinch in your water bottle is enough. Then there's seawater or marine plasma. As I've mentioned to you in other videos, marine plasma is the closest thing that exists to our own blood. On some occasions, as I've also told you, it has even been used for transfusions. And you can find bottles of seawater for human consumption in many herbalist shops. If you dilute 1 part seawater in 3 parts fresh water, you have the best conductive serum that exists, and it's also loaded with electrons. Then you also have sea moss or sea moss. And for me, this is a gem of biophysics. It is said to contain 92 of the 102 minerals the body needs to function, but it's also much more affordable than shilajit, which I won't even mention because of how complicated it is to find and be sure it's the right one. You can buy Simbos dried, hydrate it, and at home make a gel that you can add to your teas or smoothies. And then there are the little bottles with concentrated mineral drops. By adding a couple of drops to each glass, you also ensure that the water has the necessary mineral density so that the king's orders, in other words, your prefrontal cortex, reach the cells without noise or interference. Let's go back to the third point of the protocol. Seek out photons. Red or sunlight charges your mitochondria, and it does so urgently. And fourth, exercise the ibex veto and do it consciously. Take a deep breath and count to 3 before reacting. Those 3 seconds are the voltage spike your prefrontal cortex needs to reclaim the throne. The reconstruction is complete. You are no longer a victim of your genetics or chemicals or Wi-Fi. You have the plans, you have the materials, and now you also have a rapid startup protocol. The cathedral is standing, illuminated by the coherence of your own biology. And now in reality, there's only one thing left for you to do. Inhabit it with the authority of someone who knows that their energy is the ticket to their freedom. But remember that the structure is only the beginning. For life to truly flourish, we also need to understand the environment in which all of this is immersed. That is to say, that forgotten sea that is your plasma. And for you to understand the magnitude of what we are about to explore in the new series, I have to pause for a moment with you on the figure of Linus Pauling. Linus Pauling was not only the only man in history to have received 2 unshared Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and one for peace. He was also the rebel who dared to say that the medicine of the future would not treat symptoms, but would adjust the molecules to their correct place and quantity. Pauling was the one who discovered the alpha helix, that spiral geometric structure that allows your proteins to vibrate and conduct electricity flawlessly. He did not see your body, not as a sack of disordered chemical reactions, but as a sacred architecture of liquid crystals. And he sensed that disease is not a failure of the parts, but a lack of harmony in the geometry of the plasma that surrounds them. He taught us that your health depends on the coherence of that internal environment. And that's why, after closing this cycle of rebuilding your cathedral and mine, we are ready to descend to the fosse, to the forgotten sea, which bathes each one of your bricks and gives meaning to the entire system. We are going to discover how that matrix is not just a transport liquid, but a storehouse of light, a semiconductor that you yourself, thank you, can learn to program. Get ready, because if the cathedral is the temple we have built, plasma is the electric spirit that inhabits it and keeps it permanently illuminated. So I'll see you in the new series, Plasma, the Essence of Life. If you like the video and think it could be useful to others, you would do me a great favor by sharing it. In this way, you will help me spread knowledge. And I return to what I always tell you. Go forward. Always forward. And I'll read your comments. Thank you very much.